Hi, welcome to the studio. I am Mike Zipser, and with me is Bill Lawhorn. Now, Bill does not write science fiction, edit science fiction, or publish science fiction, but he's a fan and he helps run science fiction conventions, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Bill, welcome to Fast Forward.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Now, let's talk science fiction conventions. There's a lot of different kinds. How would you describe a science fiction convention if you had to?
Well, that kind of depends, Mike, on which part of the convention you're talking about. Out front, a lot of people generally, and depending on the type of convention, it can go all over the place. Behind the scenes, organized chaos.
Yes.
So to go through, I mean, a lot of people have heard of things like New York Comic-Con or San Diego Comic-Con, Dragon Con, South by Southwest. Those are all conventions that are related to science fiction and fantasy. There's also, though, a lot of smaller regional conventions, local conventions, conventions that are focused only on one particular thing. The Harry Potter universe has its own conventions. There are several Doctor Who conventions throughout the United States and around the world. And so there's, depending on what you like, there's almost always a convention for an individual who likes something in the science fiction fantasy genre.
Yeah, probably almost every weekend somewhere.
Yeah, and trying to not conflict with somebody when you're planning a convention is one of the difficult choices.
Yeah.
Our local convention, Capclave, gets to go up against New York Comic-Con every year. We tried to avoid them. We shifted weekends in order to avoid them, and by God, their convention center opened up for them on the same weekend. So there we are. We're up against New York Comic-Con. Our small literary convention still does its thing. We focus on, in our case, it's very focused on short fiction, in science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, horrors included in that. We even give out awards. A lot of that's one of the things that the community is known for.
Right.
There's things like the Hugo Awards, which many people have heard of, which is given out each year at the World Science Fiction Convention. The members of that vote for it. So in some respects, it's kind of like, I believe, the Academy Award of science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah, sort of. The other thing is that, you know, there's differentiation between what a lot of people call fan-run conventions and the kind of franchised or for-profit conventions like the Comic-Cons.
Although some of those are actually, they're still fan-run, and
right.
It takes a lot of fans to put on a convention. When you think about some of the bigger ones, you're 70,000, 150,000 people. They need people to help. And in some cases, they pay people to help line manage and do registration and have full-time staff. In other cases, the whole thing is done by fans, volunteering their time and spending hundreds of hours and paying to attend on top of it. So, because the budgets of conventions are just that tight in a lot of cases.
And there's all different sizes of conventions. If you don't like big crowds, there's conventions that are a couple hundred people.
Actually, there's some that are even smaller. There's some fanzine conventions. So fanzines are small little publications that are done by individual fans, and they send them out to their friends or anybody who wants to be on their list. And there's fanzine conventions that are 50 to 100 people max. So, I mean, they can get really small in some cases. There's, for people who like to create and then wear their own costumes, there are conventions specifically for those costumers.
Right. And conventions that are tied more to books, there's general conventions and there's horror-related conventions, there's conventions just for fantasy, there's conventions that tie into kind of fairy tales in particular.
Mm-hmm. And of course, then let's not forget that it breaks out by age a little bit too. There's things like the YA Lit festivals that are going on all around the United States right now. And I think going into the world where it's looking at those books that are written for generally with a protagonist that's somewhere in their teens, high school age, middle school, high school age, and then there's the middle grade, which there's some conventions that focus on that, but the YA is a little more common to have it. And the funny thing about the YA conventions is there's a lot more adults there than students in a lot of cases, because there's in some respects the YA it gets the genre down to its core. It doesn't try and beat you down. It doesn't try and get you with well written, like overly written, I guess is what I'd call it. Sometimes adult fiction can get so lost in writing the words in the perfect verse that they forget about anything happening.
I read a lot of what is marketed as YA fiction.
Yeah, and I've read a fair amount myself. Let's face it, Harry Potter is YA.
Yeah.
That's the I guess that's kind of the big one. But there's so much more, and that's even blending into TV. Things like the CW's 100 is based on a book.
Yep.
And based on a series. Mind you, the book and the series, TV series, they've diverged a little bit, like Game of Thrones has diverged now and getting even further from the actual books. Yeah.
Now, we talked some about what kinds of conventions there are. Let's talk a little bit about what happens if somebody goes to a convention. What kind of activities are there? What happens?
Well, I mean, the first thing that happens to a person who wants to attend a convention is they need to get a membership. That can happen well in advance by going online to the website of the individual convention, or it can happen, you can walk up and at the door, in some cases you can do that. Some conventions, they have a cap, and when they reach it, they don't sell any additional memberships. So purchasing in advance is actually good for the individual because you also save a little money. Yeah. So that's the first thing. So you've got your membership, and now you're going. Well, the first thing you do when you get to the venue, often a hotel or a convention center, is you find registration. And there will be people who are there volunteering or being paid, depending on the type of convention, who will, when you come up and say, hey, I'm Bill Lawhorn, I'm registered for the convention, and they'll go through their box of badges and they'll hand you your badge and they'll greet you and they'll hand you materials which include a list of events, which is actually also online generally, and most conventions now have an app on the phone in order to let you know in advance what things are going on, so you can kind of plan your convention experience. So you've gotten your badge, you've been greeted. Sometimes they'll hand out some ribbons that denote things, especially for first-time attendees. One of the things that's going on a lot more now is they'll have, first convention or first time at this convention, and what that does is it let people who come to conventions more often know, oh, this is somebody that might need a little help. They're open maybe to meeting new people, and so it's kind of an indicator that, hey, this is somebody that you want to reach out to.
And you can greet them and talk to them and get to know them and make them feel part of the convention. Because a lot of what goes on at convention is community.
And social, and being social. So, when you're coming to a convention, there's two ways you can do it. You can come by yourself, or you can come with a group of friends or family. And there's no one way is better than the other. But then what happens is, and sometimes the convention experience is shaped by who you're traveling or coming with. Because if you're by yourself, then you're maybe more often looking for somebody to connect with. Whereas with the group, sometimes that can be a little isolating, and it's not a bad thing because you still have a shared experience. But it's people are a little less likely to try and join a larger group because it can be a little intimidating for some people.
And you mentioned all the events, because there's programming going on, which can be panels,
workshops,
writers or fans talking about all different kinds of things.
All the different aspects. You have, so when you go to a Comic-Con, you'll have the actors and maybe the directors and the writers. They'll be on stage and they'll talk about the show and the book, and at some point they may actually allow the audience to do questions. At smaller conventions, you're more likely to have local authors, or they may bring in, the convention, depending on the type, may bring in an actor from a show. I mean, one of the common things is they'll bring in a lead actor from a show was popular in the past, because there is a cost associated with bringing in a media guest. Or authors, there's costs with bringing them in, but then they'll also be there. I mean, one of the cool things in the U.S. is George R.R. Martin from Game of Thrones, and many other books, but let's face it, Game of Thrones is it for most people. He will go to a little convention in the middle of Montana that's maybe a 200 person convention. It'll be explode in size a little bit that year, for everybody in the area will come and see it. But he'll go there and he'll talk, and he'll hang out with people, and people get an experience with him. That's a smaller convention. A bigger convention, there's going to be handlers, there's going to be security to make sure that he can get to his stuff. Because the problem is that really popular authors, it just happens sometimes that it's people, well, hey, how's it going? Hey, can we do a photo? And it's like, hey, I got to go. I don't want to be mean, but I got to get to this thing. So that's actually one of the things, is to kind of recognize some of the, and people need to do some social skills. It's recognizing body posture and accepting, hey, sometimes people have to be someplace and do that. And we kind of got off track a little bit. So going back to...
But there is, in a lot of the conventions that are kind of book-oriented, there's a lot of writers.
Yeah.
And there's autographing sessions, and they'll be hanging out in the bar.
Or in the hallway.
Or in what's known as the con suite.
Which is a place where people can gather. There's tables. They can maybe, depending on the convention, there might be board gaming, or tabletop gaming, or D&D going on at tables. Often there's some sort of refreshments and snacks. Depending on the convention, it may be part of your membership. In other cases, you may be paying for it. So that's one of the things. And then, of course, one of the things near and dear to my heart, and I believe yours, is the dealer's room, where you find all sorts of vendors. I mean, when you think about the big shows, Comic-Con, a lot of it really is about the vendors and being seen and doing photos and looking at the comic books or the costumes or wands or pens. So I mean, there's all sorts of different things you can find in the dealer's room, and depending on the convention, you'll see a whole bunch of different things. I mean,
used books,
new books, rare books, and depending on the convention, times you'll see a little more. There's
you'll see artists selling prints and originals too
in the dealer's room, or the artists might be in the art
show.
And the art show is a place where there's often an artist guest of honor, and there's a special display of them. But then there's also going to be other more local artists or people who are willing to travel depending on the convention, and you'll see displays of their artwork, and much of it is available for sale.
Yeah.
And sometimes maybe it's just it's a print, and the difference there is the original we'll think of, and there's digital originals now, but we're going to go back to the kind of old school. Think of the original as the oil and canvas, and then there's the print, which is like a high quality photo of that oil canvas. And the print, of course, is going to be a much lower cost to individuals if they're allowing it for sale. So that's kind of the different thing. So you've got your art show, and then you've got the panel programming that's going on. There's in a lot of conventions, there's music programming going on. Some of
what's
it is
known as filking.
Sometimes it's filk, sometimes it's concerts. There's been some changes in that. Filk is, of course, kind of fanish
songs
and folk music.
Yeah.
A lot of it's folk music based that I've noticed. And then we've got that. We talked about dealer's room, and then there's stuff that's going on in the whole art show. And then
there's just
hallway.
the hallway where people are just hanging out and talking and singing, and there are hall costumes. People to a lot of conventions come in costume and are walking around, and
And of course, at some conventions, if you are a big fan of the Soviet Union, there's a line culture where you get to stand in line for many hours to see anything that you want to see. Other times, depending on the size of the convention, you're very fortunate that you don't really have to line up for anything, and you can kind of bounce into from panel to panel to panel, or run out, grab food, hang out with your friends, grab a drink. So there's a little bit for everybody. And then, of course, there's one of the things that happens is, depending on the size of the convention, and that there's also children's programming. So some conventions will also set aside, and they'll have, for an extra fee, child care services. And of course, in that case, for safety purposes, they'll have somebody who's certified for child care activities, so that there's no concerns over
who's taking care of your kids.
Right. So you've got that, and then there's children's program, and then you have the workshops.
Yeah, and even more importantly, the parties.
Well, come on, we're on TV.
Not an official necessarily part of the convention, but there will be in the evening parties held by all different kinds of groups, clubs and.
Individual authors will do that as book launches. You'll also have publishing houses that come in, magazines will host parties, and just individual fans will host them. One of the things that also goes along with that, Len, is something you find in the hallways. In a lot of places, they have kind of the fan table row, and other conventions will be at conventions promoting themselves, so you can learn about other conventions in your area.
Yeah, and clubs.
And clubs. And this is not, and of course, let's remember, this is not something that's isolated to the United States or any one part of it. There's conventions going on around the world. A friend of mine from South America, they've been working on, and they've had 2 or 3 conventions now in Brazil. And of course, Europe has a very strong convention culture as well. They have a Eurocon, which rotates around all over. But then a lot of individual countries have their own. France is a very strong culture, as of course the UK is actually one of the strongest. Right. And Ireland is working on theirs, and then in Sweden, Finland, Norway, they all have very strong cultures. And I know actually Poland is also another country that has a very strong tradition of conventions.
Yeah, and we've been talking all about.
And I forgot about China.
Yeah,
China has conventions that are like twice the size of San Diego Comic-Con. People think San Diego Comic-Con's the be-all end-all, but the Chinese, they blow it out of the water. I mean, it's amazing how big some of their conventions are.
And something I want to talk about is if somebody's going to a convention, whether it's the first time they've gone to a convention or they've been going for a while, something to do to really get into it, to really get to be part of it, is to volunteer. There's always a volunteer desk, and you can just go up and say, I want to help, and they'll find something to do, and you can meet new people, make new friends.
And that's very true. And that's, for some people, they can't commit to hundreds of hours of work in the lead up, but they can show up and say, hey, I got 2 hours. What can I do? And sometimes it's as simple as going around and holding up a sign that says you've got 5 minutes left. But a lot of times, one of the places they need a lot of help is generally the con suite, because hours on the feet and moving stuff, it can be tiring, and it's nice to have somebody there who can talk and answer questions. Volunteers are generally not going to be asked to be security, because
right.
You want somebody who's
been
been trained and is known by the committee. But there's registration, sometimes they'll help.
Yep.
Watching doors, they'll let people do. And so, I mean, there's little things you can do, and they're not little, they're actually big.
They're really important, and they're a way to get involved. I mean, I got started working on conventions by volunteering at a local convention, and you probably did too.
Well, mine actually started at work. I was at work, and one of my coworkers, an older gentleman, comes up and says, hey, you read science fiction. There's this club, you should come by.
Yeah, that's the other way, is through the clubs.
And in this case, I actually was in the club for about 2 years before I went to even their local convention. It was just timing. Now, when your best friend's back home is getting married, you go back home to that. If there's a reunion, you go back to the reunion. Then after a point, got asked to help out and do some stuff, and I ended up running an evening activity at our 4th local convention. And I just, the evening activity, I just went and used my knowledge and skills from college and put them to good use, and we had a good time. And
that's the key thing, is have a good time. Yeah. That's what happens at conventions. You have a good time.
And you develop your own persona. And the other thing is that when you start, especially in areas where you have several conventions relatively close by, you start to see a lot of the same people, and there's definitely a family aspect, and there's lots of hellos, and so but don't feel intimidated by if you see that. And if you're there, it's like you can be part of that group without having to do the work.
Yeah.
And then one of the things that people will get involved in conventions with is because as you learn to do more things within the convention structure by volunteering and taking more responsibility,
you get more involved.
And at some point,
we're out of time
already.
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us.
Sure, and we didn't even get to the best part.
I know. Well, that's it for those of us here at Fast Forward, and this is Mike Zipser saying take care and go to a convention.